Picture this. You're standing in the shadow of a weathered cathedral. Its stones are dark with age, their edges worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. But as your hand brushes the cold wall, you notice something strange. A carving that shouldn't be there. A style of chisel mark historians say didn't exist until 200 years after this building was supposedly razed. And it isn't just this cathedral. Across Europe, in the dusty pages of medieval chronicles, in the whispered legends of villages, in the star maps of monks and the travel logs of merchants, there are cracks, tiny fractures in the story we've been told. Some say it's nothing, a coincidence, a quirk of how records were kept in the chaos of the Middle Ages. But others believe these cracks hide something far darker, a lie. Not a small one, not a king fudging his birth date, or a scribe making an error, but a lie so massive, so breathtaking in its ambition, that it rewrote the very calendar of the world. A medieval conspiracy that fooled everyone. And tonight, we're going to follow those cracks wherever they lead. Through crumbling monasteries and battlefields that may never have existed, past forged charters and maps that defy the known timeline, into the vaults of power, where the truth was locked away. But before we step into the shadows, make sure you're ready for the journey. If you enjoy unraveling history's deepest mysteries with me, if you want to hear the stories they'd rather you never found, take a moment to subscribe. It lets me know you're one of the few who are willing to look past the official version. Now, pull your cloak a little tighter. The night is long, and the road is darker than you think. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Century. It begins, as all great conspiracies do, with a question so simple it's almost embarrassing. What if 300 years of history never happened? This idea first crept into scholarly circles in the late 20th century, proposed by a man named Heribert Illig. His phantom time hypothesis claimed that the years between 614 and 911 AD were largely fabricated, inserted into the timeline by powerful medieval rulers who wanted to place themselves in a different historical context. Most historians scoffed. The Middle Ages were already shrouded in enough mystery, why invent more? But Illig pointed to something intriguing. A suspicious gap in the archaeological record. Walk through the layers of an ancient city's ruins, Rome for example, and you'll find the strata of time like slices of cake. There's the bustling marble glory of the empire, the slower, rougher architecture of the late classical period, and then you should find the early medieval layer. But in many places that layer is paper thin, almost non-existent. Where are the coins, the pottery, the graves? It's as if, for centuries, life barely happened. To be fair, the early medieval period was a time of turmoil. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed, Europe fractured into warring kingdoms, and written records became scarce. But Illig's point was that the absence wasn't just scarcity, it was a void. In monasteries across Europe, manuscripts jump from the late 600s to the early 900s, with barely a few pages in between. In some chronicles, decades are covered in a handful of sentences. A famine here, a plague there, a war that seems suspiciously similar to another one written a century later. And then there's the architecture. Take the Aachen Cathedral in Germany. Officially commissioned by Charlemagne in the late 8th century, it looks, by stylistic analysis, 2 centuries ahead of its time. The proportions, the domed octagonal chapel, the imported marble, it's as if someone from the High Middle Ages reached back in time to build it. Illig suggested that Charlemagne himself might be part of the problem, or the fabrication. That this towering figure of medieval Europe was less a man and more a myth, stitched together from fragments of earlier rulers, and inflated into a godlike emperor by later chroniclers. If true, this would mean that the history you learned in school, that neat continuous timeline from Rome to the Renaissance, isn't just slightly off, it's wildly wrong. Whole wars, reigns and inventions would slide centuries forward or backward. Famous battles might never have been fought, legendary kings might never have lived at all. Even more chilling is the question of why someone would do this. Illig pointed to 3 suspects. Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. Together, he claimed, they had both the means and the motive to correct the calendar. Why? Prestige, power, the desire to make their own reigns align with a significant year, 1000 AD, a date steeped in apocalyptic and symbolic weight. But if that's the case, they didn't just fudge the books, they bent the flow of time itself, retroactively fabricating events, genealogies, and entire eras to make the numbers fit. Most historians dismiss all this as pseudo-history, but even skeptics admit the early medieval period is full of unanswered questions. Why do astronomical records from that era sometimes fail to match modern calculations? Why do so many architectural styles appear to leap ahead without gradual development? And perhaps the most unsettling thought, if such a deception were possible, how would we ever know? Chapter 2. The Phantom Crowns. If the missing centuries were just a matter of lost records, we could shrug and blame the chaos of the Dark Ages. But what happens when the people who supposedly lived during those centuries start overlapping, sometimes impossibly, like ghosts in the historical record? Let's start with a king. Or maybe two kings, or maybe one man wearing two crowns, in two different places, separated by more than a century. In the official version of events, we're told about two rulers, Louis the Pious, son of Charlemagne, and Louis II of France, who reigned more than 100 years later. Their reigns are separated by time, geography, and dynastic change. And yet, when you place their biographies side by side, something unsettling happens. The parallels are almost perfect. Both are second sons who inherit the throne after the unexpected death of an older brother. Both are pious to the point of political weakness, often clashing with ambitious nobles and rebellious sons. Both suffer humiliating defeats in battle, and die after periods of civil unrest. Even their physical descriptions, tall, thin, with a soft expression and a tendency toward melancholy, are eerily alike. Coincidence? Perhaps. After all, history does have patterns. But then you begin to see it elsewhere. In England, the reigns of Edward the Confessor, 1042–1066, and Edward II, 1307–1327, share uncanny similarities. Both kings' reigns are marked by political infighting, a lack of direct heirs, and foreign advisors whose influence causes public outrage. Even certain anecdotes, the king's fondness for hunting, his reluctance to personally lead troops into battle, seem lifted from one chronicle and dropped into another. It's as if someone, somewhere, took an existing historical template and simply rebranded it for a new century. This is where the idea of phantom crowns emerges. Rulers whose reigns may not have been entirely real, but rather carefully constructed narratives, duplicated and redistributed across time to fill in fabricated centuries, or to legitimize current rulers by linking them to glorious or cautionary past examples. The motive for such a fabrication would have been straightforward. Power needs lineage. In the medieval world, the right to rule wasn't just about military strength. It was about bloodlines, legitimacy, and continuity. The easiest way to strengthen your claim? Invent a noble ancestor or two. Pad the family tree. Make it appear that your dynasty had been on the throne for centuries instead of decades. And when you're the church, that fabrication takes on a theological dimension. Imagine the ability to place a devout, church-friendly monarch in the past, to rewrite history so that piety and obedience to Rome were always the natural order of things. Suddenly your authority looks eternal, inevitable, God-given. But how exactly would they do it? Through the scribes. In the medieval world, the written word was almost exclusively in the hands of monasteries, cathedrals, and royal courts. If a king or pope wanted to create, or erase, a reign, all they had to do was command the scribes to copy it into the chronicles. Once the original documents were destroyed or altered, the new version would be the only version. And in a world without mass printing, no one could easily compare accounts from distant lands. Take the case of the Frankish Chronicles, a series of annals recording the reigns of Merovingian and Carolingian kings. Modern historians have noted abrupt stylistic changes in the middle of certain reigns, as if a new hand had suddenly taken over, yet without any explanation. Dates seem to drift, events are repeated years apart with only minor changes in detail, and entire battles appear suspiciously similar to earlier ones. And then there are the royal seals. Seals were the medieval equivalent of a signature, pressed into wax to authenticate decrees and charters. Yet in several cases, seals attributed to kings a century apart are virtually identical, not just in design, but in wear, as if the same physical stamp had been used. Skeptics will say that these are coincidences, that kings imitated their ancestors, that chroniclers reused language from earlier sources out of habit, that seals were copied because they were traditional symbols. But the pattern is too consistent, too deliberate. It's as if the missing centuries were populated with placeholder kings, phantom crowns meant to make the false timeline look real. And here's the chilling part. If even one of these rulers was fabricated, how many others might be as well? How much of what we think of as medieval history is nothing more than an elaborately staged drama, written centuries after the fact? In the next chapter we'll follow the trail not to kings, but to the one institution that could manipulate all of Europe's records at once, and perhaps had the greatest reason of all to do so. Because if the phantom crowns were the actors, the church may have been the playwright. Chapter 3. The Papal Plot. If the phantom crowns were the actors in our play, then the church may well have been the director, quietly orchestrating the entire performance from behind the curtain. To understand why, we have to step into the medieval papacy, a world of gold-threaded robes, candlelit councils, and political maneuvering so intricate it would make modern power brokers blush. The medieval church was more than a spiritual authority. It was an empire without borders, stretching across kingdoms and languages, uniting much of Europe under one supreme leader, the Pope. This was an institution that could excommunicate kings, crown emperors, and decide the legitimacy of a ruler with a stroke of the quill. And one of the most powerful tools it possessed? The calendar. It's easy to forget that in the Middle Ages, the measurement of time itself was largely under the Church's control. The Julian calendar, inherited from Rome, was already out of sync with the solar year by the 10th century, but reforming it wasn't just about astronomy, it was about symbolism. Imagine this: your Pope Sylvester II in the year 999. Europe is gripped by millennial fever, whispers of the world's end. The year 1000 isn't just a date, it's a prophecy. And if you could align your reign, or that of your allies, with such a charged moment in history, you could shape the very narrative of God's plan on earth. The theory goes like this: Sylvester II, Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, and Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII conspired to push the calendar forward. By adding phantom years, possibly hundreds, they could place themselves in what would be recorded as the dawn of a new millennium. Why would this matter? Because history is not just a record of the past, it's a tool to control the present. If your reign falls at a prophesied time, you appear chosen. If your enemies' reigns are shuffled into obscurity, or written out entirely, they vanish from collective memory. And here's where it gets darker. The Church's scribes weren't just recording events, they were actively shaping them. Royal genealogies were reworked to show divine favor. Ancient pagan festivals were redated to align with Christian holy days. Even saints' lives were sometimes altered to place their miracles in a politically useful century. Consider the case of St. Malachi's prophecies. Though written centuries later, they were attributed to the 12th century Archbishop of Armagh. These predictions eerily match the sequence of popes from the Middle Ages onward, almost too perfectly. Could they have been backdated, slipping into the record, as if they had always been there? The papal archives, vast, labyrinthine, and fiercely guarded, remain one of the most tantalizing mysteries in all of history. Locked behind Vatican walls are documents stretching back more than 1,000 years, many of which have never been seen by any living historian outside the Church. If any proof of a deliberate rewriting of time exists, it could be buried in those archives, in a codex no one is allowed to open. But here's the catch: the Church wasn't the only player with a stake in reshaping the medieval timeline. Monarchs were deeply invested too, because aligning themselves with papal blessing meant securing both spiritual legitimacy and earthly power. We see hints of this cooperation in the donation of Constantine, a forged document supposedly granting the Pope authority over vast territories. Though proven fake centuries later, it shaped political boundaries and power struggles throughout the Middle Ages. If such a forgery could alter the political map, why not forge time itself? And when you control time, you control history. And when you control history, you control the future. In the next chapter, we'll step away from the parchments and power plays, and look instead at something you can still touch and see today: the stone bones of medieval Europe. Because in the very walls of its cathedrals and castles, there may be proof that our timeline has been tampered with. Chapter 4. The Silent Cathedrals. The deeper you look into the medieval timeline, the more you begin to see that this conspiracy isn't confined to the dusty pages of chronicles or the whispered schemes of popes and kings. No, the evidence is also written in stone. Walk into a Gothic cathedral. Let your eyes climb the vaulting arches until they vanish into shadow, your gaze following ribbed stone ribs that seem to grow upward, like the bones of some ancient beast. Sunlight filters through stained glass windows, casting colored halos across the flagstones. You might think you're standing in a church built in the 13th or 14th century, but what if the records told you it was built in the 10th? This is where things get strange. Architectural historians have long noted that the timeline of Gothic architecture is, in some cases, suspiciously compressed. Certain cathedrals appear decades, or even centuries, ahead of their supposed time. Their designs feature engineering techniques that should not have existed until much later. Take the Aachen Cathedral, the so-called Palatine Chapel of Charlemagne. Officially completed in the year 805, it contains structural elements and decorative styles that align far more closely with architecture from the 11th or even 12th century. The same is true for portions of the Speyer Cathedral in Germany, which supposedly began construction in 1030, yet its massive vaults mirror techniques documented much later in France. Even stranger are the ghost projects. These are cathedrals and abbeys whose construction records seem to vanish for decades. Builders would lay a foundation and then, on paper, nothing would happen for 50, 100, sometimes even 150 years. Then suddenly, a fully mature Gothic style would appear atop the original base. It's as if time itself skipped forward for these buildings. And when you start to match these architectural anomalies with the phantom time hypothesis, the coincidences pile up. Those suspicious gaps in cathedral construction often fall within the same centuries Illig and others claim were invented. Consider also the phenomenon of anachronistic reuse. In several cathedrals, sculptures, stained glass, and carvings, supposedly dating from the 8th or 9th centuries, bear uncanny resemblance to, and in some cases are indistinguishable from, art from the 12th. Were medieval craftsmen truly able to predict artistic trends centuries before they happened? Or were these objects simply misdated deliberately? The records of medieval stonemasons, when they exist, offer tantalizing clues. In the archives of certain European cities, wage records for masons appear in short bursts, followed by decades of silence, then resume without explanation. Some historians chalk this up to incomplete archives. But if you believe the conspiracy, these gaps aren't missing history, they're invented history. And then there's the matter of style. Architectural style evolves slowly. The pointed arches, flying buttresses, and elaborate tracery of late Gothic design didn't emerge overnight. They developed through trial, error, and gradual refinement. Or so we're told. But in some regions, those refinements seem to appear fully formed, with no transitional phase in between. It's as if the blueprints were already in hand, waiting for the right century to be declared. If architecture is the frozen music of history, then in these cathedrals the song skips forward, notes missing, harmonies rearranged. And unlike parchments or relics, stone does not lie easily. These are not errors of translation or transcription. They are physical contradictions, solid as the walls you can still touch today. But perhaps the most haunting evidence is in the inscriptions. Hidden away in less visited corners of some churches are foundation stones engraved with dates that don't match the official histories. In one case, a partially eroded stone in a French abbey bears a date that, if read plainly, places its construction nearly 300 years earlier than the style suggests. The official guidebooks don't mention it. Whether these anomalies are deliberate or accidental, one fact remains. Europe's sacred stonework doesn't quite line up with its sacred timelines. And if these silent cathedrals are speaking the truth, it means our medieval history has been carved, not just written, into a shape the real past never took. In the next chapter, we'll leave the cool hush of the cathedrals and step into the smoke and ink of the monasteries, because there, among the vellum and candlelight, lies the story of entire centuries of history that went up in flames. Chapter 5: The Manuscript Massacre. The medieval world kept its memory in ink. If kings and popes wrote the headlines of history, the monasteries were the libraries that kept the back issues. Every charter, every royal decree, every treaty, birth, marriage, and death worth remembering. If it was to survive, it had to pass through the hands of monks. Day after day, they sat bent over desks in scriptoria, quills scratching across vellum by candlelight. The work was slow, sacred, and exhausting. But here's the strange thing. For entire stretches of the early Middle Ages, especially between the 7th and 10th centuries, whole collections of manuscripts simply vanish. Historians often explain this as the result of fires, wars, and the natural decay of fragile parchment. And yes, medieval fires were common. Candles, oil lamps, and wooden buildings made monasteries tinderboxes. Viking raids too reduced many abbeys to smoldering ruins. But when you start to trace the pattern, the destruction feels almost too neat. Take the monastery of Fulda in Germany, one of the intellectual powerhouses of the Carolingian Renaissance. Its archives were supposedly destroyed in a fire around the year 900. Conveniently, this erases a large portion of the very centuries the phantom time theory calls into question. Or look to England's Canterbury Cathedral archives. where an 11th century chronicler matter-of-factly reports that earlier records were lost to flame during the time of Archbishop Odo in the 10th century. Again, right in the period of our suspicious gap. France, Italy, Spain. Over and over, in the decades that span the vanishing centuries, we hear of catastrophic losses of documents. And yet, curiously, many of these monasteries continued to thrive afterward. Their landholdings remained, their income streams from tithes were unaffected, and construction projects carried on. If these fires were truly devastating, wouldn't the institutions themselves have faltered? Then there's the matter of revised copies. In many cases, after a loss of documents, replacement chronicles appear, often decades later, written by monks who are not eyewitnesses to the events they describe. These copies frequently contain events that align with the political needs of their own time, rather than the past they claim to record. Some medieval chroniclers even admitted to altering or fabricating earlier records. The monk Orderic Vitalis, writing in the 12th century, casually notes that he corrected older annals to match the true history. True, of course, being whatever the current ecclesiastical and royal authorities decreed. And when you compare these replacement chronicles to one another, patterns emerge. Battles fought twice. Kings dying in 2 different years. The same plague sweeping across the land in different centuries with eerily similar descriptions. If the conspiracy theory is correct, these manuscript losses were not tragic accidents, they were controlled burns. An opportunity to erase inconvenient truths and replace them with the corrected version of the past. Imagine the scene. A small group of scribes in a high, smoky chamber, pulling charred pages from an iron box. They glance at one another in the flickering light, the weight of their task pressing on them. Then, under the watchful eye of an abbot loyal to the Pope or a local ruler, they begin to write, not from memory, but from instruction. The past is being rewritten, and only a handful of people will ever know. But there's one thing fire cannot destroy: the sky. Because above the shifting parchments and edited genealogies, the stars keep their own records. And in those celestial archives, some anomalies are even harder to explain away. In the next chapter, we'll look up, past the cathedrals and the smoke of the scriptoriums, into the night sky as it appeared in the Middle Ages. And there, in the constellations, we may find proof that the centuries we think we know might never have existed at all. Chapter 6. The star map that shouldn't exist. If parchment can be rewritten, and stone can be repurposed, there's one witness to history that is much harder to tamper with. The sky. The stars are not fixed, though they seem to be. Over centuries, they shift ever so slightly, due to a phenomenon called precession, an almost imperceptible wobble in Earth's axis that slowly alters the position of the constellations. Ancient astronomers didn't know the mechanics, but they could chart what they saw. And because of precession, we can date historical observations with surprising precision, like a celestial fingerprint. Which makes it all the more baffling when medieval star maps don't match the skies of their claimed era. Let's start with the Byzantine star catalogue of Constantine VII, the scholar-emperor often tied to the phantom time hypothesis. Compiled in the 10th century, or so the official story goes, it records the position of constellations in ways that more closely match the sky of the 7th century. Was this just sloppy copying from older sources, as mainstream historians insist, or is it evidence that the 10th century was, in large part, an invention? Then there's the Carolingian astronomical records, including observations from the court of Charlemagne. Certain eclipses, comets and planetary alignments described in these chronicles simply didn't happen in the years given. Modern astronomical software lets us rewind the sky, and in many cases, the events match more closely with dates hundreds of years earlier or later. Take, for example, the eclipse recorded in the Annales Lauresenses as occurring in the year 809. When we check the actual celestial data, no such eclipse was visible in Europe that year. But one was visible from the exact same locations, on May 1, 577. The descriptions are so precise, down to the color of the moon and the length of totality, that the odds of coincidence are nearly zero. If the dates are wrong, then the chroniclers either lied or copied from a much earlier record and passed it off as contemporary. And if this happened once, perhaps it was a mistake. But when it happens over and over, in records from England to Italy, the pattern starts to feel deliberate. And then there is the Canterbury manuscript, a curious piece of astronomical work that includes a map of the night sky over southern England. It is dated to the mid-900s, yet when astronomers plotted the star positions, they aligned most accurately with the year 680. That's not just a minor shift, it's centuries. Skeptics argue that medieval monks were simply recycling ancient Greek and Roman star charts, and that these mismatches are the result of bad copies. But if that were the case, Why are so many of the astronomical events, eclipses, comets, meteor showers, described in detail as though they had just been witnessed? Why frame them as present-day occurrences if they were known to be ancient? And here's where things get truly unsettling. Some of the fabricated dates don't just misplace events, they seem to rearrange history to fit a predetermined narrative. Certain comets are tied to the rise or fall of kings. Eclipses are presented as divine omens validating papal decrees. Meteor showers as signs from God for victorious crusades. If the dates were manipulated, then the heavens themselves were enlisted as propaganda. But if the stars are a clock, then the clock is telling us something is off. And if we can't trust the parchments, the cathedrals, or even the recorded heavens, then the next question becomes, what about the catastrophes? Because there's one event in medieval history that should have left an undeniable physical footprint: the plagues. And yet, in at least one case, that footprint is strangely absent. In the next chapter, we'll descend from the cold clarity of the night sky into the fevered shadows of a medieval epidemic, one that some historians now suspect may never have happened at all. Chapter 7. The plague that wasn't plagues leave scars. They scar the people who live through them, the landscapes that bury their dead, and the very layers of the earth beneath our feet. Mass graves, hastily dug, packed with the bodies of men, women, and children. Abandoned villages collapsing into the soil, written records dripping with the dread of a sickness that sweeps through without mercy. So if a plague truly swept through medieval Europe, it should be there, in the bones, in the soil, in the chronicles. It should be impossible to miss. And yet there is one plague that seems to have existed almost entirely on paper. The chronicles call it the Great Pestilence of the 9th century. Supposedly, around the year 869, a virulent disease spread across parts of Europe, killing untold numbers and altering the course of kingdoms. Monastic records speak of famine, depopulation, and villages left to the wolves. Priests wrote of ringing church bells for the dead until their hands bled. But here's the problem: archaeologists can't find it. Mass graves from that period? None. Burial sites that show a sudden, overwhelming spike in mortality? Absent. Even pollen records, which can reveal sudden shifts in land use when fields are abandoned, show no dramatic change. It's as if this plague simply didn't happen. Some historians argue that the event was exaggerated. Maybe it was a smaller, localized outbreak, an illness that killed hundreds, not thousands, later inflated in the telling. But the wording in the chronicles is clear. They describe a devastation on the scale of the Black Death, which came centuries later. The deeper problem is that the Great Pestilence is suspiciously similar to another epidemic described in Byzantine sources a few centuries earlier, the Plague of Justinian. The symptoms match. The death toll matches. Even the spread, from the east toward the heart of Europe, is the same. It's as if someone took the earlier event and reinserted it into the timeline under a new date. Why would they do that? One possibility is narrative convenience. Plagues were often used in medieval chronicles as divine punishment, a way to explain the fall of a ruler, the loss of a battle, or the moral decline of a people. If you wanted to weaken the historical image of a certain kingdom, or bolster the image of a rival, inserting a plague into their reign could do it without needing to fabricate military defeats. Another possibility is simpler: filler. If the missing centuries were being backfilled with invented events, a plague was an easy choice. It required no battles to account for, no new rulers to invent, just a sweeping disaster that could be described in vague but dramatic terms. But the absence of physical evidence is glaring. Archaeologists can track the real Black Death of the 14th century in excruciating detail. There are plague pits from London to Barcelona, mass burials in rural churchyards, and skeletal remains showing the telltale signs of Yersinia pestis infection. The 9th century plague leaves no such trace. And here's where it gets even more suspicious. In the decades following this phantom plague, several kingdoms suddenly appear weakened in the historical record, ripe for conquest by emerging powers. Was the plague invented as a pretext for political shifts that were themselves fabricated? If that's true, then the 9th century pestilence wasn't an epidemic at all. It was a story. A story that shaped the map of medieval Europe, written not by survivors, but by architects of the timeline itself. And if they could forge a disaster, they could just as easily forge greatness. In the next chapter, we'll follow the trail to the scholars, those medieval minds whose work survives under different names in different centuries. Because some of history's greatest thinkers might not just be products of their time, they might be products of multiple times. Chapter 8. The Great Scholar Swap. If you want to hide a conspiracy in plain sight, one of the easiest places to do it is in the works of scholars. Unlike kings, whose lives are anchored by coronations, battles, and alliances, scholars exist mostly in ink and parchment. Their words survive when their bodies don't, drifting across centuries through copied manuscripts, translations, and commentaries. And in the hands of the wrong people, those words can be moved, reassigned, and even duplicated, until we're left with two geniuses, separated by centuries, who sound suspiciously like the same man. Let's start with the philosopher John Scotus Eriugena, a towering intellectual figure of the 9th century. He was a theologian, a translator of ancient Greek works, and a bold thinker whose ideas often put him at odds with church orthodoxy. And yet, certain passages of his writings, especially his commentaries on logic and metaphysics, are nearly identical to those attributed to later medieval scholars, particularly the 12th century philosopher Peter Abelard. Mainstream historians explain this as influence. Abelard, they say, was simply drawing on earlier works. But in some cases, the earlier manuscripts that could have inspired Abelard no longer exist. They vanished conveniently before Abelard's lifetime, and all we have are copies made after his career began. Were these truly copies of older works? Or were they retroactively assigned to earlier thinkers to pad the intellectual record of phantom centuries? The same phenomenon appears in the world of medicine. The Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, Ibn Sina, written in the early 11th century, contains medical theories and remedies strikingly similar to those described by a supposed 8th century European physician named Theodoric of York. But Theodoric's works are preserved only in much later copies suspiciously aligned with Avicenna's innovations. And then there's the mathematician Gerbert of Aurillac, better known as Pope Sylvester II. He's credited with introducing the astrolabe and the Arabic numeral system to Europe in the 10th century. Yet his methods, diagrams, and even his teaching style match almost exactly those of a 12th century Andalusian scholar named al-Zarqali. Did Gerbert truly introduce these tools 2 centuries earlier? Or did the timeline bend, assigning al-Zarqali's achievements to an earlier, church-approved figure? If the phantom time hypothesis is right, the great scholar swap served 2 purposes: filling the empty centuries. By transplanting the works of later thinkers into earlier centuries, the fabricated timeline gained depth and credibility, control of intellectual legacy. By attributing certain ideas to Christian scholars centuries earlier, the Church could claim precedence over Islamic or pagan sources, framing Europe as the true originator of knowledge. And it wasn't just about individual works, it was about entire schools of thought. The sudden reappearance of Aristotelian philosophy in 9th century Europe, for example, has long puzzled historians. How did so much Greek knowledge, supposedly lost for centuries, suddenly re-emerge fully formed? The standard answer is that it came through contact with the Islamic world. But if the missing centuries were fabricated, the re-emergence may not have been sudden at all. It may simply have been a chronological shell game. Picture a scribe in a monastery in the year 950, holding a freshly copied manuscript in his hands. The original was written just decades earlier in Islamic Spain, but he carefully inscribes a false colophon, translated from the Greek in the year of our Lord 720, by the hand of brother so-and-so. In that instant, the work has been shifted backward by over 200 years, its true origins hidden, its place in the fabricated timeline secured. And once these false attributions were accepted, they became unassailable. Later scholars would cite them, building new works on the false foundations. The timeline reinforced itself. But knowledge is not the only thing that can be forged. Faith can be too. In the next chapter, we'll explore the forbidden relics, holy objects that refuse to match their supposed histories, and which may hold physical proof that the medieval centuries we think we know are a carefully constructed illusion. Chapter 9. The Forbidden Relics. Relics were the beating heart of medieval faith. From shards of the true cross to the bones of saints, from vials of holy blood to cloaks said to have belonged to the Virgin Mary, Europe's churches were filled with objects believed to channel divine power. They drew pilgrims from across the continent, poured wealth into abbeys, and gave rulers both legitimacy and leverage. But what if some of those relics didn't belong in their time? What if, instead of proving the sanctity of the past, they exposed the cracks in it? Take, for example, the Shroud of Turin. Believed by many to be the burial cloth of Christ, it bears the ghostly image of a crucified man. The Church officially dates it to the time of Jesus, yet carbon dating performed in the late 20th century placed its origins squarely in the 13th or 14th century. That's hundreds of years too late. The Church responded with skepticism, suggesting contamination, repair, or testing errors. But what if the date is right, and it's the timeline that's wrong? If large chunks of medieval chronology were artificially inserted or compressed, then the 13th century might not be where we think it is. In a distorted calendar, the relic could be ancient after all, or more provocatively, the relic could be entirely fabricated, planted as part of a grand scheme to reinforce a rewritten past. Then there are the holy nails, said to be the actual spikes used in the crucifixion of Jesus. By the 10th century, there were more than 30 of them scattered across Europe, all claimed as authentic. Some were mounted in crowns, others in reliquaries, some embedded in cathedral walls. But here's the problem. The earliest written records for many of these nails only appear after the 8th century, during the exact period the phantom time hypothesis targets as invented. Before that, silence, no references, no veneration, no processions. It's as if these relics were simply conjured into the historical record when the church needed them most. Or consider the lance of Longinus, the spear said to have pierced Christ's side. There are at least 3 major authentic versions, each with a carefully constructed pedigree, and all surfacing in medieval Europe within a span of 2 centuries. How could the same weapon exist in 3 places? Historians write it off as medieval forgery, churches competing for prestige. But what if it was something more coordinated? What if these objects weren't forged for local fame, but fabricated to populate a timeline that needed miracles, relics, and signs to appear where none naturally existed? Archaeological digs have also turned up a strange pattern. Relics said to be from the 7th, 8th, or 9th centuries are often buried with artifacts, coins, pottery, tools, that date to the 11th or 12th. In some cases, the soil layers suggest the ground itself was disturbed later to insert older-looking items. And when you follow the money trail, it gets even murkier. The trade in relics exploded during the very period suspected of being invented. Monasteries grew wealthy by displaying ancient artifacts whose origins no one could verify. It was a perfect system. Fabricate a relic, write a backstory into a local chronicle, and watch the pilgrims come. But not all relics conformed. A few defied the narrative. There's the case of the Black Madonna of Einsiedeln, a statue said to date from the 9th century. It depicts Mary with dark skin and Byzantine features, far more in line with Eastern Orthodox iconography than Western European art of the time. The local records insist it was carved by a monk in the year 860, but stylistic analysis suggests it belongs to a later century, or perhaps even earlier. Was it imported from the East, or was the date of its origin deliberately falsified to fit a timeline already slipping from reality? And then there's the Book of Kells, an illuminated manuscript of the Gospels so ornate, so advanced in its artistry, that many scholars have marveled at how it could have emerged so early, in the 9th century, supposedly isolated on an Irish island. Its techniques appear nowhere else in that time period. It is, in many ways, an anachronism made of ink and gold leaf. Relics were supposed to affirm faith and history, but these forbidden relics, misdated, duplicated, or misplaced, whisper of something else, that the past we think we know might have been furnished like a stage play. Every actor costumed, every prop carefully arranged. In the next chapter, we'll explore a different kind of relic, a map, one that shows coastlines not officially discovered until centuries later. A relic not of faith, but of knowledge. A forbidden artifact not buried in a church, but hidden in the folds of the known world. Chapter 10, The Merchant's Map. There are places on Earth that were supposedly unknown to medieval Europe. Lands beyond the edges of the parchment, seas not yet sailed, coastlines waiting in the dark for explorers centuries in the future. But what if some of those lands weren't unknown at all? What if someone knew, and simply decided the world wasn't ready? This is the mystery of the Piri Reis map, a surviving fragment of a world chart drawn in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis. The surviving portion shows parts of Europe, Africa, and astonishingly, a nearly accurate depiction of South America's eastern coast, centuries before the continent was officially explored in full. But there's something even more troubling. The map not only shows Brazil with impressive accuracy, it also appears to depict the coastline of Antarctica, not as an ice-covered wasteland, but as a chain of rocky landmasses, coastlines that, according to modern geology, have been buried under ice for thousands of years. When the map was first studied in the 20th century, researchers speculated that Reis must have drawn on much older sources, possibly ancient ones. But where would a 16th century Ottoman admiral have obtained maps drawn in the age before satellites or sonar, maps that captured shorelines beneath glacial ice? Piri Reis himself gives us a clue. In the margin of the map he wrote that he compiled it using 20 charts and mappi mundi, some drawn by Portuguese and Arab navigators. Others he claims came from the time of Alexander the Great. Most of these source maps of course are lost. Which raises the question, if earlier civilizations had this information, why did it vanish? And who controlled its return? Enter the medieval merchant. Scattered throughout the records of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries are travel journals, ship manifests, and letters that hint at knowledge far beyond what their writers should have possessed. In one letter, a Venetian trader describes sailing west of the sun and encountering lands where the stars are wrong. In another, a Genoese captain refers to the lands of gold that lie beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, long before Columbus or Vespucci set sail. These accounts were long dismissed as sailors' tales, but what if they were real? What if a small group of navigators had knowledge of lands beyond the Atlantic, and that knowledge was deliberately suppressed? Because if the phantom time hypothesis is correct, then timelines weren't just shifted to create political power. They were also bent to control the narrative of discovery. If a king, pope, or empire could erase earlier contact with the Americas, then when they chose to rediscover those lands, they could claim them cleanly, with no rival claims, no prior treaties, no inconvenient truths. It would explain the uncanny accuracy of certain medieval portolan charts, maps that appear in the 13th and 14th centuries, with precise coastlines, magnetic declination lines, and distances that weren't supposed to be known until the Renaissance. It would explain why Christopher Columbus, when he sailed in 1492, seemed unusually confident, not like someone discovering a new world, but like someone following directions. There's evidence he carried maps drawn from older, secret sources that may have circulated among elite trading families and navigators for generations. There are whispers, too, of the Zeno map, a 15th-century chart of the North Atlantic showing detailed knowledge of Greenland, Iceland, and even parts of North America. Though its authenticity is debated, the geography is shockingly accurate for its time. If these maps are genuine, then medieval Europe had far more knowledge of the wider world than we've been told. And if those maps were suppressed or altered, then someone deliberately decided what parts of the world could be known, and when. It turns the age of exploration into something else entirely, not a dawning of curiosity, but a carefully scheduled unveiling. And if they could erase contact with continents, what else might they have erased? What about the people, the bloodlines, the heirs to thrones who simply vanished? In the next chapter, we'll follow the trail of the missing queens. Noble women who were written out of history, their existence erased, their children unacknowledged. Because nothing reshapes a timeline faster than changing who sits on the throne. Chapter 11. The missing queen's history remembers kings. Their names are carved into stone, chanted in coronations, burned into the spines of books. But queens? Queens are more fragile, easier to erase. And if you want to rewrite a kingdom's past, you don't need to forge wars or fabricate treaties. You just need to remove a mother from the story. Across the patchwork tapestry of medieval Europe, there are curious gaps in the genealogies of royal families, gaps where queens should be. Let's begin with the Carolingian dynasty. Charlemagne's line, if the official records are to be believed, is extensively documented. His wives, his concubines, his children, meticulously listed. And yet, in the case of Pepin I of Aquitaine, there is no surviving documentation of his queen Ingiltrude. Despite mentions of her in later chronicles, her name vanishes, her lineage becomes uncertain. More than one chronicler refers to Pepin's children, especially Charles of Aquitaine, as sons of a noblewoman without naming her. Some even suggest these children were illegitimate, a politically convenient claim used to disqualify them from succession. But what if it wasn't about illegitimacy at all? What if her absence was part of a deliberate deletion? Removing a queen from the record unanchors her children. A potential heir becomes a bastard. A rival branch of the royal family loses its claim. And a manufactured heir, from a more convenient line, can be crowned without question. Then there's the case of Queen Emma of Normandy, wife to two English kings, Ethelred the Unready, and King Cnut the Great. She was one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, a queen who straddled dynasties and secured the throne for her sons. And yet, in several royal chronicles, her influence is downplayed or omitted entirely. Her letters, her grants of land, her involvement in succession, redacted in later editions. Some versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle barely mention her. Others imply her children came not from her, but from mistresses, casting doubt on their legitimacy. When her tomb was opened centuries later, her remains were found disturbed, scattered with bones from other burials. Was this desecration symbolic? A physical representation of how her legacy had been broken apart, repurposed? The conspiracy grows thicker when you examine noble houses of Burgundy, Aragon, and Sicily. In multiple cases, princesses vanish between one generation and the next. Betrothals are recorded but never consummated. Queens die without cause, or their marriages are recorded without names. Entire lines of descent grow murky, conveniently erased just before a rival house takes the throne. And in every case, the absence creates space. Space for new narratives, new heirs, new claims. But how was this done? The same way all the best lies in medieval Europe were spread. Through the monastic scriptoria. The genealogies were rewritten. The royal charters redrafted. The portraits painted over. And queens, already considered secondary to their husbands, were the easiest to cut away. If a woman's lineage threatened a ruler's claim, her entire story could be folded into myth, labeled heresy, or simply struck from the records. Even the Capetian dynasty of France, considered one of the most stable in Europe, has inconsistencies in the records of its early queens. Some names appear only once. Others contradict local records. In one instance, a queen is listed in a charter, then disappears from every other document. No birth, no death, no children. What happened to these women? Did they die young? Were their names lost to time? Or were they deliberately removed? Because the truth of their children, their alliances, or their claims would unravel the carefully curated royal timeline. Here's the most chilling part. Many of the queens who vanished did so during the same centuries. The phantom time hypothesis claims were fabricated. Their absence was not an error. It was necessary. A forged timeline couldn't risk the messiness of real maternal lines, real heirs, real claims, so they were excised. Surgically, politically, permanently. In the next chapter, we'll step into the battlefield. But not just any battle. One that seems to repeat itself across centuries, with the same tactics, the same outcomes, and sometimes, the exact same language in the chronicles. Because if wars can be duplicated, and history is just theater, then we've entered the era of the recycled siege. Chapter 12: The siege that repeats in history. Battles are supposed to be unique. Different kings, different cities, different stakes. And yet, throughout medieval chronicles, we find something deeply unsettling. Identical battles, recorded centuries apart. Same strategies. Same weather. Same quotes. Same outcomes. It's as if a scribe, reaching for historical drama, simply dusted off an old script, changed a few names and hit copy. But what if it wasn't laziness? What if it was intentional, a piece of the larger puzzle, meant to fill in phantom centuries with stories that felt familiar, because they were familiar? Let's begin with a pair of sieges separated by 226 years. The Siege of Amorium in 838 AD, where Abbasid forces stormed a Byzantine city after a long campaign. And the Siege of Thessaloniki in 1064 AD, also led by Muslim forces against a Christian stronghold. The accounts preserved in separate chronicles describe a deceptive feigned retreat, a breach on the eastern wall just before dawn, a miraculous rainfall during the battle, a massacre in the church plaza, survivors taken east into slavery. The same 5 elements. Not just similar, identical in structure, sequence and tone. It's as if the siege was retold, with only the place and date changed, like a folktale retitled for a new audience. Now consider the Battle of Clavijo, supposedly fought in 844 between Christian forces and Muslim invaders in Spain. It's famous for the miraculous appearance of St. James the Moorslayer, who descended from the heavens to fight for the Christians. The battle became a cornerstone of Spanish national myth. But no Arab sources record it, no letters, no burial sites, no coinage, no aftermath. It's absent from contemporary Christian sources too. The first known mention of the battle comes 300 years later, coincidentally during a period when Spain needed historical validation for its Reconquista ideology. Was the battle fabricated? Or was it lifted from an earlier, smaller skirmish, and inflated to mythic size to give legitimacy to modern kings? Then there's the Battle of Brunanburh, in 937, where King Aethelstan defeated a coalition of Vikings and Scots to unify England. The event is documented in poetry that reads nearly line for line like an earlier chronicle of King Offa's campaigns, poetry written 2 centuries earlier. The names change. The battlefield shifts, But the rhythm, the phrasing, the moral framing are the same. It's more than mere repetition, it's pattern. Historians sometimes chalk this up to literary tradition, a tendency to stylize battles using shared heroic tropes. But when the chronicles themselves echo the same metaphors, the same storm-racked dawns, the same last charges by noble cavalry, it starts to feel like something else. It feels like a formula, a template for how a battle is supposed to look. And that template gets reused again and again, especially in the shadowy centuries under suspicion, 614 to 911 AD, and adjacent decades that seem suspiciously padded with conflict after conflict that left no archaeological trace. Some of the great battles from those years leave no weapons, no graves, no burnt soil, just ink, just words. And here's where it turns truly sinister. By creating recycled wars, the forgers did more than create compelling history. They explained power shifts. They invented threats and triumphs to justify dynastic changes, or to elevate certain leaders by comparing them to ancient heroes. They crafted history not as memory, but as scripture. A repeated siege wasn't just a story, it was a political tool, one that could be duplicated whenever a new king needed legitimacy or an enemy needed vilification. And the public never questioned it. Why would they? The past was handwritten, and there was no way to cross-check timelines, to notice that the same ambush had happened in two places, centuries apart, under two different banners. But some noticed. In marginal notes, scribes whispered doubts. A monk in Trias scrawled beside one battle account, "Too alike the tale of our fathers, too clean, too staged." He didn't live long enough to ask more questions. But we can. Because if battles were borrowed, and queens erased, and maps misplaced, then what about the documents themselves? In the next chapter, we'll descend into the buried vaults of a European castle, where one such secret cache was uncovered. Dozens of manuscripts, scorched and sealed, their contents known only to a handful of modern historians. And what they found inside might prove that history has been edited in ways we were never meant to see. Chapter 13. The Burned Library. It begins in silence, not with a bang of discovery, but the creak of old hinges deep beneath a castle in Central Europe. In 1945, as the final battles of World War II scarred the continent, Allied forces took control of a medieval fortress in Austria. The castle, long abandoned and repurposed for wartime storage, had been partially destroyed by artillery. While clearing rubble from the lower levels, a soldier stumbled upon a hidden door, bricked over and forgotten. Behind it, a sealed chamber, dry, untouched, and filled with books. Dozens of crates lined the walls, sealed with wax and marked with strange Latin symbols. When they were opened, the smell of burnt parchment and resin filled the room. Inside were hundreds of fragments of medieval documents, some scorched, some whole, all unrecorded in any official archive. But these weren't ordinary texts, they were duplicates. Charters supposedly from the 9th and 10th centuries that were nearly identical, word for word, to ones known from the 12th. Treaties dated to 870 bearing the handwriting style of 1100. Monastic records naming abbots whose existence was already confirmed, centuries later. It was as if someone had gone to great effort to backdate an entire shelf of history. More alarming were the annotations. Many documents contained marginal notes in faded ink, written in shorthand Latin, referencing corrected chronology, approved alignments, and duplicates for southern libraries. One charred page listed what appeared to be targeted abbeys across Europe, each marked with years and script types. Scholars who reviewed it later suggested it was a guide for distributing and replacing forged documents. The entire find was dubbed the Burned Library of Liechtenstein, and its existence has been kept largely secret outside a small circle of medievalists and archivists. Most of the surviving documents were quietly transferred to private university collections, or simply vanished. The soldiers who found the cache were told the discovery had no historical significance. But why were the documents burned? The leading theory is chilling. The chamber may have been a forgery lab, used during the early Renaissance or even earlier to create or alter key texts supporting fabricated historical claims. When the castle fell out of use, the chamber was sealed. Some documents were burned deliberately, likely to destroy older conflicting records that contradicted the new timeline. Even more intriguing, one scorched codex was partially deciphered in 1967. It described a series of royal successions that differ wildly from the accepted medieval narrative. Kings we've never heard of, queens whose names don't exist anywhere else, whole battles and treaties that appear in no other record. It's as though the book preserved a version of medieval history that was later erased and rewritten. The implications are staggering. If the burned library is authentic, and every examination so far suggests it is, then there was, at some point, a deliberate effort to edit European history, replacing genuine documents with curated, improved ones. It wasn't just about controlling the past, it was about silencing it. Imagine how many more hidden vaults exist beneath castles, monasteries, or cathedrals. How many fires were called accidents, but were instead acts of deliberate historical arson? How many scribes knew they were preserving lies, or trying to save fragments of truth before it was all consumed? Because here's the truth behind this conspiracy. Forgers don't just create lies, they bury the alternatives. And sometimes, they leave behind traces, a word in the margin, a seal that doesn't match, a date that shouldn't exist, a fragile thread waiting to be pulled. In the next chapter, we'll follow one such thread, hidden in the most unexpected place, the edge of a monk's doodle. A cryptic, repeating symbol that appears across multiple medieval texts. A code, perhaps, pointing to the secret all these forgeries were meant to protect. Because when the lies pile high enough, someone always leaves a message behind. Chapter 14. The code in the Chronicle. Medieval manuscripts are strange creatures. They are sacred and flawed, elegant and crude, reverent and personal. In the margins of these holy texts, between prayers and genealogies, you'll often find doodles, a rabbit playing a harp, a knight fighting a snail, a monk with devil horns. Historians call them marginalia, often dismissed as medieval graffiti, but in a few cases, these whimsical flourishes may hold something more. Something hidden. It began with a discovery in the St. Gall Abbey Library in Switzerland. Tucked into a 10th century chronicle, a timeline of kings and saints, was a tiny mark, a curved triangle with 3 dots inside, scrawled beside the name of a ruler historians now believe may never have existed. At first, it seemed meaningless, a random flourish, but then a second mark was found, in a different manuscript, from a different country, attributed to a different century. And then a third, a fourth, always the same shape, always in the margin, always near a passage that now appears historically suspect. Researchers dubbed it the Tria Signum. And as more were catalogued, over 40 by the early 2000s, a pattern emerged. Each instance appeared next to a fabricated or altered figure. Phantom kings. Battles with no physical record, papal decrees that contradict other documents. The mark always hovered nearby, like a silent accusation. Could it have been a signature? A signal passed between scribes? A secret sign that they were copying text they knew was false? One marginal note, translated from Latin beside a 9th century charter in Spain, reads, "He is the lie they have chosen. I leave the mark for those who follow." The writer's name is lost, the ink is faded. But the message, "I leave the mark for those who follow," echoes like a whisper from the edge of time. And it doesn't end there. When scholars overlaid a map of all known Tria Signum appearances, a curious alignment appeared. They form a curve across Europe, tracing a path from Ireland through France, Switzerland, northern Italy, and into Eastern Europe. A trail, perhaps, not just of scribes, but of a network of those who knew. Not all medieval scribes were complicit in the conspiracy. Some must have suspected. Others knew, and quietly resisted. They couldn't stop the falsification. But they could mark it, code it, leave a breadcrumb for future minds to trace. Other variations of the symbol have emerged, drawn into the illuminations of manuscripts, woven into the borders of prayer books, carved faintly into wooden book covers. One manuscript from Bohemia even includes a diagram of the mark, next to a cryptic phrase, "He who rewrites kings, rewrites the stars." What does it mean? That time was altered so thoroughly that even celestial events were reassigned? That the conspiracy touched not only history but cosmic order? Perhaps the Tria Signum was a quiet rebellion, a way for scribes, trapped in service to powers they couldn't defy, to slip one final act of resistance into the record. A way to say, this is a lie, a warning to the future, a wound in the page. And here's the strangest thing of all. No medieval instruction manual ever mentions this symbol. No record of its use appears in monastery training documents. It is not in calligraphy guides, margin glossaries, or official heraldry. It exists only where the timeline frays, where something feels off, where reality bends to convenience. A code in the chronicles, waiting for us. And if it's real, If the tria signum is what it appears to be, then we have more than theory, we have a voice, calling out across centuries, trying to expose what others buried. But what was the purpose behind it all? The forged kings, the false battles, the vanished years, the maps, the relics, the edits. What was so dangerous about the truth, that someone would rewrite centuries to hide it? In the final chapter, we follow that question to its inevitable, haunting end. A secret so grand, it reshaped time itself. A conclusion hidden not in stone, nor scroll, but in silence. Chapter 15. The lie agreed upon. There's a quote often attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte. History is the lie agreed upon. It's the kind of phrase that feels clever at first, and then terrifying once you begin to suspect it might be literal. We've followed threads of falsified battles, duplicated rulers, forgeries in stone and ink, erased queens, and impossibly accurate maps. We've found symbols in margins and voices echoing warnings through forgotten monasteries, and all of it, every fragment, every doubt, leads us here. To the question that's haunted us from the start: why? Why fabricate 300 years of history? Why move stars and saints and sons of kings to places they don't belong? What was so powerful, so valuable, that it was worth editing time itself to protect? The answer may be simpler and darker than we hoped. Power. Not the kind drawn by sword or crown, but the quieter kind, the kind that comes from owning the past. Because history is not just memory, it's authority. When you control the past, you define the present, you justify borders, you sanctify bloodlines, you declare whose gods are older, whose people were there first, whose kings are descendants of divine will. By inserting phantom centuries, certain rulers could tie themselves to ancient greatness, skipping the hard work of legacy building. They could claim a divine right not from decades of leadership, but from ancestry conveniently edited to exist. For the church, the stakes were even higher. By adjusting the calendar, it could place its authority at the heart of time itself. It could align Christendom's spiritual dominance with apocalyptic prophecy, positioning its leaders at the cusp of the sacred year 1000, when the world was believed to end and begin anew. But here's the other possibility, the one no one wants to say aloud. Maybe it wasn't just about hiding something behind us. Maybe it was about making sure we never look forward. Because if 3 centuries were invented, what does that do to the rest of the timeline? To the very century we call modern? To the prophecies of return, the second coming? The end times? The rebirths promised after 1,000 years of darkness? What if those things weren't meant for someday? What if they already happened, and the evidence was buried beneath phantom kings and staged crusades and rewritten stars? Could we be living in a time built after the age that was supposed to end? Could the Middle Ages be not a period we passed through, but a false corridor hiding something we were never supposed to see on the other side? Maybe the phantom centuries weren't just filler. Maybe they were a wall. And maybe the tria signum, the marginal code left by frightened scribes, wasn't pointing backward at lies, but forward, toward a future we've been denied, toward something missing, a prophecy that didn't fail, a kingdom that didn't fall, a truth that was too dangerous to remember, and so they burned the libraries, erased the queens, rewrote the maps, and agreed to believe a lie, because to know the real truth would shatter everything. So now, we are left in the quiet. The scribes have long since fallen silent. The cathedrals still stand, but they will not speak. The queens are gone, the scrolls are dust, and the sky keeps its secrets. Maybe you felt it too. Somewhere deep in the spaces between the stories. A feeling that the pieces never quite fit. That the centuries we were taught to trust feel too clean, too tidy, too arranged. Maybe it's in the way history repeats, not by accident, but by design. Or in the eerie precision of a star chart that knew too much. Or in a monk's doodle that wasn't a doodle at all, but a warning. And maybe now you understand why so many walked away from this trail. Why entire departments dismissed it as pseudo-history. Why those who tried to chase it found their questions answered only with silence. Because this isn't just about the Middle Ages, it's about the scaffolding of reality. We build our sense of self on the bones of the past, but what if those bones were moved? What if the story of how we got here was, itself, a story? What would that make us? Pilgrims in a fiction. Sleepwalkers in a dream curated by popes and emperors, and frightened men with ink-stained fingers. Caretakers of a clock whose first 3 hours were never set. You could spend a lifetime tracing these threads. You could cross Europe, Dig beneath abbeys and read every surviving charter. You might find more marks in the margins. You might even find another burned library. But what you'll never find, what none of us will, is certainty. Because if the conspiracy is true, then everything else you thought you knew might only be true afterward. And if it isn't true, well, you've still walked through shadows. You've still stood beneath a cathedral too advanced for its time. You've still held a parchment whose dates don't match the sky. And now, whether you believe it or not, you will never look at a medieval timeline the same way again. So rest now, traveler. Close the books, let the candles burn low. The past is a country no longer mapped, but if you listen closely, you might still hear the sound of pages turning in the dark, a whisper of ash, an echo of stone, and a question, quiet, unending, unresolved. What year is it, really?